22 inches that left the doctor amazed. But what really happened in that hospital room? A young nurse finds himself drawn into a complex and emotional journey when a mysterious patient arrives. This is a story of unexpected connection, forbidden tension, and a twist that no one saw coming. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more captivating stories like this one. It was supposed to be a quiet night, the kind where I could catch up on patient charts and take a few deep breaths between rounds. But in the hospital, quiet nights rarely stay that way. I was at the nurse's station, organizing supplies, when the emergency doors burst open. The commotion pulled my attention immediately. A paramedic was wheeling in a stretcher, and on it lay a man who seemed larger than life. His body was covered in dirt and blood, his muscular frame barely fitting on the narrow stretcher. His black hair clung to his forehead, damp with sweat, and his jawline, even under the bruises, looked chiseled from stone. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to look away from the man who appeared both broken and invincible. Male, early 30s, probable fractured femur and suspected internal injuries, construction site fall. The paramedic barked. The team rushed him into a trauma room, and I grabbed a pair of gloves, falling in step behind them. As a nurse, I'd seen my fair share of injuries. But something about this man held my focus. Maybe it was his sheer size, the way his limbs sprawled across the stretcher. Or maybe it was the fleeting moment when his green eyes opened and locked with mine, before fluttering shut again. There was a defiance in his gaze, a determination that seemed to say, "I've been through worse." Inside the trauma room, the controlled chaos began. Nurses and doctors worked seamlessly, stabilizing him while I monitored his vitals and prepared the necessary tools. The attending physician, Dr. Martinez, was assessing the X-ray images of his femur. When the scans came up on the screen, the room went quiet. 22 inches, Dr. Martinez muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Longest femur I've ever seen. There was a ripple of chuckles from the staff, the kind of levity often used to diffuse tension in high-stakes situations. I tried to focus on my task, but I couldn't shake the strange pull I felt toward this man. His name, Lucas Miller, was scribbled on his chart, but he was already more than just a name to me. Something about him made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. After hours of surgery, Lucas was moved to recovery. His femur had been repaired with a rod, and his vitals were stable. My shift was almost over, but I found myself lingering near his room. I told myself it was because I wanted to check on his progress. But deep down, I knew it was something else. When I finally stepped into the room, Lucas was awake. His eyes, more vivid now, followed me as I entered. "Hey," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm Alex, your nurse. How are you feeling?" He smirked, faintly, his voice raspy but smooth. "Like I fell off a building, but I guess that's accurate." Despite myself, I laughed. "Well, you're lucky to be here. It could have been a lot worse." "Lucky," he repeated, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. "Yeah, sure." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I adjusted his IV and checked his monitors, all the while hyper-aware of his gaze on me. It wasn't the first time a patient had watched me work, but this felt different, intimate, almost. "Thanks, Alex," he said, as I turned to leave. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it stopped me in my tracks. I glanced back, my heart racing. "You're welcome," I replied, unsure why those two words carried so much weight. As I walked back to the nurse's station, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas Miller wasn't just another patient. There was something about him, something magnetic and dangerous, and as much as I tried to push it from my mind, I knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. Sleep had been elusive, my thoughts consumed by Lucas Miller, the patient who had disrupted the quiet predictability of my shift, and somehow, my mind. I told myself it was the kind of concern any nurse would feel for a critical patient. But the weight in my chest, and the way my stomach fluttered at the thought of seeing him again, told me otherwise. When I entered his room during my rounds, Lucas was sitting up slightly, his green eyes alert. He looked better than the night before, though the bruises on his face were still stark against his skin. The tension I had felt the day before returned, stronger now that he was conscious and aware. "Morning," I said, my voice catching slightly. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a wrecking ball," he replied, his smirk returning. "But I guess I should be grateful. You guys did a hell of a job putting me back together." His words were casual, but his gaze lingered on me in a way that made my skin heat. I focused on adjusting his IV drip, trying to keep my composure. "You're recovering well," I said, "but you'll need to stay off that leg for a while. No heroics." Lucas chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. "Noted, Nurse Alex." The way he said my name sent a shiver down my spine, and I cursed myself for letting him affect me like this. I was a professional, after all. But there was something about Lucas, something I couldn't resist, even if I wanted to. Over the next few days, Lucas became a fixture in my routine. He was the kind of patient who made himself impossible to ignore, with his sharp wit and the easy charm that seemed to fill the room. He was flirtatious, but never overt, his comments towing the line between playful and sincere. I found myself looking forward to our conversations, even though they left me feeling unsteady. One afternoon, while I was checking his vitals, Lucas asked a question that caught me off guard. "So, Alex, how long have you been a nurse?" "2 years, I replied, glancing up from the monitor. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged, a hint of a grin on his lips. "Just trying to figure you out. You're different from the others." "Different how?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even as my heart raced. Lucas tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were studying me. "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out." His words hung in the air, heavy with implications I wasn't sure how to interpret. I cleared my throat, focusing on the chart in my hands. "Well, don't think too hard. You're supposed to be resting." He chuckled, but the intensity in his gaze didn't waver. "Resting's overrated." Later that evening, I found myself lingering outside his room. I didn't have a reason to be there, at least, not a professional one. I told myself I was checking on his progress, but the truth was harder to admit. There was a pull I couldn't explain, a need to be near him even though I knew it was dangerous. As I stepped inside, Lucas looked up from the book he was reading, his face lighting up in a way that made my chest tighten. "Couldn't stay away, huh?" he teased. "Just doing my job," I replied, though the words felt hollow even to me. Lucas set the book aside, his expression turning serious. "You're a terrible liar, Alex." The air between us felt charged, the kind of tension that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to say something, to deny the accusation or change the subject, but the intensity of his gaze held me captive. Before I could respond, the door opened, and Dr. Martinez stepped inside. "How's our star patient doing?" he asked, oblivious to the moment he had interrupted. Lucas smirked, his attention shifting to the doctor. "Alive and kicking. Well, not kicking just yet." I forced a laugh, grateful for the distraction, but my heart was still racing. As Dr. Martinez went over Lucas's treatment plan, I excused myself, my pulse pounding in my ears. I needed air. I needed space. Most of all, I needed to figure out what the hell was happening to me. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed every interaction with Lucas in my mind. His words, his smile, the way he looked at me as though he could see right through me. It was all too much. I had crossed an invisible line, and there was no going back. I didn't know where this was heading, but one thing was clear. Lucas Miller was dangerous in ways I hadn't anticipated. And the more I tried to resist, the more I felt myself falling. The next few days blurred together, my routine consumed by the steady hum of the hospital. But no matter how busy I tried to make myself, my thoughts always drifted back to Lucas. His presence lingered long after I left his room, like the ghost of a touch I hadn't dared to feel. It was during one of those quiet moments, between rounds, that I found myself standing outside his door again, the small nameplate with Lucas Miller staring back at me. I took a breath before pushing it open, determined to keep things professional. Inside, Lucas was sitting up in bed, his green eyes lighting up the moment he saw me. "Alex," he said, his voice low and warm. "I was wondering if you'd forgotten about me." I rolled my eyes, but the smile tugging at my lips betrayed me. "Not a chance," I replied, stepping closer to check his chart. "How's the pain today? Manageable?" he said, shrugging slightly, though I can't say the same for the boredom. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Well, you've still got a few days before you're discharged. Maybe use the time to rest." Lucas tilted his head, his smirk deepening. "Resting's boring. I'd rather talk to you." I should have brushed the comment off, but something about the way he said it, soft, unassuming, made my chest tighten. "You're impossible," I muttered, focusing on the IV drip to avoid meeting his gaze. "And yet, you keep coming back," he teased, his tone lighter now. "Maybe you don't mind it." I glanced at him, and for a moment the air between us felt heavy again, filled with unspoken things I wasn't sure I was ready to face. "I'm just doing my job," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Sure you are," he replied, leaning back against the pillows. His smirk faded slightly, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. "You're not like the others, Alex." The words caught me off guard, my pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" Lucas hesitated, his eyes searching mine, as though he was trying to decide whether to say more. "You care. It's different. I can see it." Before I could respond, the door opened, and one of the senior nurses stepped inside. "Alex, we need you in room 14, she said, her tone brisk. I nodded, grateful for the interruption, even as disappointment flickered in my chest. "I'll be back," I told Lucas, my voice steadying. "Try not to get into trouble while I'm gone." His laugh followed me out the door, a sound that stayed with me long after I left his room. That evening, after my shift ended, I found myself wandering the hospital halls instead of heading straight home. I told myself it was just to clear my head, but my feet carried me back to Lucas's floor without conscious thought. His room was dimly lit when I peeked inside, his tall frame silhouetted against the glow of the bedside monitor. He was awake, his head turning as I stepped inside. "Couldn't stay away?" he asked, his smirk making a reappearance. "Just making sure you're behaving," I replied, closing the door behind me. How's the pain? Not bad, he said, his tone softer now. It's quieter at night, easier to think. I sat in the chair beside his bed, the silence between us surprisingly comfortable. For a moment it felt like the world outside didn't exist, just the two of us, suspended in this strange bubble of connection. I don't know much about you, Lucas said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. I looked at him, surprised. There's not much to know. He raised an eyebrow. I don't believe that. I hesitated, unsure of how much to share. I've been a nurse for 2 years, I said finally. Moved here after college. That's about it. That's not all, he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Why nursing? The question caught me off guard. I like helping people, I said, though it sounded too rehearsed, even to me. Lucas studied me for a long moment before nodding. Fair enough. As the conversation drifted to lighter topics, I felt myself relax in his presence. He told me about his work in construction, the dangers and the camaraderie that came with it. I found myself laughing at his stories, his easy charm breaking through the walls I didn't realize I'd built. But as the hour grew late, reality began to creep back in. Lucas was a patient, and I was his nurse. Whatever connection we felt, whatever pull drew us together, it wasn't supposed to happen. Still, as I stood to leave, he caught my hand, his touch sending a jolt through me. Alex, he said softly, thanks for staying. His eyes held mine, and for a moment I forgot where we were, who we were. You're welcome, I murmured, my voice barely audible. As I walked out of his room, my heart was racing. I knew I was crossing a line, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Lucas Miller wasn't just another patient. He was becoming something much more dangerous, and I wasn't sure I wanted to resist. The next few days passed in a haze. Every shift felt like a countdown, until the moment I'd see Lucas again. I told myself I was imagining things, that the way his eyes lingered on me and the softness in his voice when he said my name were all in my head. But each time I entered his room, the tension between us grew thicker, more undeniable. It was late in the afternoon when things began to shift. Lucas was sitting upright in bed, his chart balanced on his lap as I entered. He smirked when he saw me, the expression making my pulse quicken in a way I hated to admit. You're late, he said, his tone teasing. I rolled my eyes, setting his medication on the side table. Didn't realize we were keeping track. Maybe I just like seeing you, he replied, his voice dropping just enough to make my chest tighten. I paused, meeting his gaze. Lucas, relax, he interrupted, his smirk softening into something almost serious. I'm just messing with you. Mostly. The air felt charged, every word carrying weight neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I busied myself with his IV, pretending not to notice the way he watched me, his gaze heavy and unrelenting. You don't scare easily, do you? He asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. I looked up, startled by the question. What? Lucas tilted his head, his green eyes narrowing slightly. Most people would have been running for the door by now, but not you. Why is that? I hesitated, unsure how to respond. I'm used to patients trying to get under my skin, I said finally, though it felt like a lie, even as I said it. Lucas chuckled, the sound low and warm. Is that what I'm doing? Sometimes, I admitted, my lips curving into an unwilling smile. But I think you do it on purpose. Maybe, he said, leaning back against the pillows. Or maybe I just like seeing you squirm. The shift ended hours later, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Instead, I found myself lingering near his room, the soft glow of the monitor visible through the glass. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't help it. Something about Lucas was magnetic, pulling me closer even when I knew better. When I finally stepped inside, he looked up, his smirk replaced by a look of surprise. "Off the clock?" he asked, his tone lighter than I expected. "Something like that," I replied, sitting in the chair beside his bed. Lucas studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Why do you keep coming back, Alex?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to face. "You're my patient," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Bullshit," he said softly, his voice devoid of its usual playfulness. "There's more to it than that." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Lucas leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto mine. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart was racing, every instinct screaming at me to walk away. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong, the space between us charged with something I couldn't ignore. "Lucas, Before I could finish, the door opened and a nurse poked her head inside. "Alex, we need you in room 9. Stat." I nodded, my chest tight as I stood. "I'll be back," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Lucas didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes as I left the room stayed with me long after I was gone. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of what had happened settled over me. I was crossing lines I'd sworn I never would, risking everything for something I didn't even fully understand. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself to stop, I couldn't. Lucas wasn't just a patient anymore. He was something more. Something I wasn't ready to lose, and I had no idea what that meant for either of us. The tension between Lucas and me reached a breaking point the next evening. I walked into his room after my shift, intending only to say good night. But the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world, made my resolve crumble. "Alex," he said softly, his voice pulling me closer before I realized I was moving. I sat beside him, the silence heavy between us. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his green eyes searching mine. I swallowed hard, every part of me screaming that this was wrong. But when his lips brushed against mine, I didn't pull away. The kiss was tentative at first, but it deepened quickly, years of restraint and fear melting away in that moment. When we finally broke apart, I could barely catch my breath. "Lucas, we can't." "I know," he said, his voice raw, "but I don't care." Neither did I. The next morning, Lucas's room was empty. My chest tightened as I scanned the bed, the sheets neatly folded as if he'd never been there. I rushed to the nurse's station, my heart pounding. "Where's Lucas?" I asked, panic lacing my voice. "He left," one of the nurses said casually. "Checked himself out against medical advice." I stood frozen, disbelief and heartbreak crashing over me. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. Back in his room, I found a single piece of paper on the pillow. In his handwriting, it read, "I'm sorry, Alex. I had to go. Don't forget me." I sank onto the bed, the weight of his absence unbearable. He'd taken more than just himself when he'd left. He'd taken a piece of me, too. This story reminds us that sometimes love comes at a cost. Lucas and Alex's connection was real, but timing and circumstances pulled them apart. Have you ever experienced a connection so intense, yet so fleeting? Share your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Join us for more emotional tales that remind us of the beauty and the pain of human connection.